Hi, Gareth. You can hear me?
We can hear you very well. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. I think most people know who Lucy Green is, but very briefly, Lucy is Emerita Professor of Music Education at the Institute of Education, University of London, and the author of dozens of impactful articles, several monographs, a infamous, what's the word? Really well known keynote speaker is what I was looking for. Lucy was also my teacher and my PhD supervisor, so it's an honor. And a pleasure to see you this morning, Lucy. Thank you for agreeing to be with us.
It's a huge honor for me to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I read through all the conference abstracts this morning, and I was just so excited to see what a fantastic range of perspectives you have and what wonderful papers. So, I'd like to say in advance, I'm really sorry. I did tell Gareth and Brian that I'm not able to actually attend the conference after this, but I would have loved to, and I don't know what I would have chosen to hear because there's so much going on. So you're going to have a great time.
Well, thank you so much. So we'll launch into our first question. Lucy, you're maybe the best known scholar in popular music education, in large part due to your seminal text, How Popular Musicians Learn, A Way Ahead for Music Education, from 20 years ago now. But of course, that book follows two previous monographs and is firmly rooted in the areas of sociology of music and sociology of music education. Could you explain how you came to conceive of How Popular Musicians Learn and what led to that research?
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks for saying I'm probably the most influential author in the field of popular music education. I'm quite surprised to hear you say that because, I don't feel that I am, but that's partly because time has moved on so much. As you say, that book was actually published, um, 20 years ago. It was 2001, actually, not 2002. And looking at all the amazing papers and things that people are doing now, um, it's kind of hard to explain how different music education was when I was at school. I was at school between 1962 and 1975. And although there are probably other people here from my age, it's in the past. That period is 50 years ago. It's history. So, how I came to write How Popular Musicians Learn, I think, was by growing up in that very, very different music education context to what we have now, and happening to have one foot in classical music training because I loved the piano and I learned to play the piano, classical, lessons. And I also was fortunate enough to go to a public school, which was a very good one, which had, what you in the States call a public school. It's like a state school here. It had a very good music department and they had a wonderful choir. And I was forced to play the violin in the orchestra, which I absolutely hated. So I was in this classical music education culture, and at the same time, I was in youth subculture. So I was listening to music of my age group and actually a little before me. So Joni Mitchell, Incredible String Band, and then, a bit later Bowie and all this kind of thing. And naturally enough, it would occur to one in that position why the two musical worlds, classical in school and popular out of school, were so utterly, utterly bifurcated from each other. And also I felt from various experiences I had that although I developed reasonably advanced piano skills and music reading skills and so on for my age, I had absolutely no idea how the pop musicians who created the music that I was listening to, how they went about doing it. So the question mark was kind of opened in my mind by the time I was kind of 15. And from there, a lot of things happened. It took a long time for me. As I think Gareth may have said in his question, I wrote 2 books before How Popular Musicians Learn. And the thing about those books, they're both very sociological, because that was another thing. I became really interested in the sociology of music, in the sociology of education when I was at college. particularly issues of equality of opportunity and access. And at that time, you see, there was no field of music education. There really wasn't in my country a subject called music education. There was music and there was education. And so I started to apply the sociological questions and problems from the sociology of education to music. And the people who were working in that field, Graham Vulliamy was one of them who really, really inspired me. He was a sociologist who did sort of proper sociological work in classrooms. And other people who weren't really sociologists, but they were talking about music and society. Chris Small and Keith Swanwick, these people who are still, very influential and inspiring today, of course, they inspired me. But I was still very much in the sort of critical sociology, intellectual side of things. And I wrote my first two books feeling all the time they were very heavily theoretical, for one thing, particularly the first one. And also, because they were what they were, they had to be critical, which meant that some people would have seen them as being negative. And I started to feel, hopefully they're not negative to people who read them and maybe find an echo of their own experiences within them. But there was nothing in those to help teachers to actually change their practice. So by the time I'd written the second one, I started feeling I want to do something that's going to make a difference to what goes on in classrooms. And of course, I taught in classrooms myself for 6 years, and I taught the piano for 5 years as well before I, worked at the Institute of Education, where I have been ever since. So I'd done a lot of classroom work, and I'd always done really, really practical classroom work. And I started to think, what can I do to sort of to invigorate children's motivation more than anything else in the classroom? And so these things about popular music being completely different from classical music, the way popular musicians learn, how do they do it, being an utter mystery to me when I was a youngster, it all sort of came together in this desire to do something that would make a difference. And as I think I've said to you before, Gareth, my husband, my dear husband, who is in the kitchen at the moment, he was one of those fortunate people, of which there were fewer in his generation, because he is even older than me. But one of those fortunate people who grew up as both a classically trained and also working in pop bands and things like that. So he had both these cultures, and he was always saying to me, I learnt more in the school dinner time in the practice room with my mates than I learned in the music classroom. And I honestly think, if he hadn't kept banging on about that for years, I might not have thought of writing that book. And the funny thing is, it's such an obvious book, isn't it? But it was a kind of leap for a classically trained teacher who had also been trained as a teacher and has, I know in different countries there are here, most governments have standards or a national curriculum or something that you have to fulfill in your classroom. So with all that, it was a bit of a leap to think, how do popular musicians learn? And then subsequent to that, what can I do to bring some of these learning practices into the classroom? That's probably a very long not answer to your question, but I'll stop there.
No, thank you. That's a great answer. So I think that the first book of yours that I think the first one I opened was your first book, Music on Deaf Ears, but it was too complicated, so I put it down. And then I started reading Music, Gender, and Music, Gender Education, which I direct my students to a lot. It's 25 years old nearly now.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you can tell us about three things: the main points the book makes, the previous research or lack of it that meant you needed to write that book, and where you think practice and research needs to grow in that area now.
Gosh, well, okay, I'll start with the first question. Not sure I can answer the third question too well, but I'll start.
Right. I'll answer the third one. There you go.
Tell me what the first one was again.
And the main points that you make in the book.
Oh, the main points.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Well, that book also, of course, grew out of my previous book. And I suppose the main points of it are, from a sociological point of view, that musical practices in any social context, which involve obviously the production of music, which means composing music, improvising, performing, the distribution of music, which refers to the ways that that music gets from the musician to other people. So it could be live performance, it could be recording on Spotify nowadays, it could be busking in the street, and also the reception of music. In other words, what do people do when they are using the music? Are they just listening to it in the background? Are they teaching it? Are they dancing to it? Are they playing along with it? These three things, the musical production, distribution, and reception of music, refer to the practices that people engage in musically, but they go alongside with musical meanings, which are attached to the music's practices. And in the case of gender, the main point was that the roles that women have played in music throughout history, and I focused on classical music history, but very similar thing. Oh, and a little bit on pop music as well, I did, yes, and jazz. Very similar things can be said, we now know, and knew then, I guess, about women in all kinds of different folk traditions and traditional musics all over the world, that women's roles as musicians in the production, distribution, and indeed reception of music become a part of the meaning that the music takes on for other people, and that the music itself then appears to be, in the case of gender, gendered. It appears to be feminine gendered, and similarly music which men are involved in appear to be masculine gendered. And when I say feminine gendered and masculine gendered, I'm not talking about sexed bodies, I'm not talking about females and males, but I'm talking about what counts in our society as feminine and what counts as masculine. So music itself appears to take on feminine, masculine meanings and all the other meanings that could be going on in between those. And these meanings are transmitted, of course, not only in society in general, but in schools and other music education environments as well. So teachers, as well as students themselves, are party to making assumptions about music in relation to the gender of the students and other people in and outside of the school who produce the music in particular. So I'll give you an example of this. Actually, a very good article by a chap called Robert Legg, L-E-G-G, and he's in Australia, I think now. He read this work of mine, and he was teaching a group of higher education, what we call trainee teachers, or I think we call pre-service teachers in the States, different names. I know there are people here from many countries. And he gave them a module on gender and music, and he introduced to them lots of texts and ideas about music and gender. And they said that they enjoyed the course, and you know that it was all very interesting, but it's rather in the past now because you know they are young and they don't harbour these gendered assumptions that girls all play this kind of instrument, or one of the most important assumptions that girls lack creativity. This came out of the research, and that boys have more creative spark, right? They said we don't think that now, especially we've done this course. So he set a task to these students. He asked 15, 16-year-olds in schools to compose music. And as you know, composition is a central part of our national curriculum over here, so there's nothing unusual about that. And I can't remember exactly the details of how he did it, but he switched the compositions around so that and then he asked the students to assess them. Okay, so this assessment is really, really important, because if you get a grade A or a grade C, it can affect your life, right? So he asked the students to assess the compositions, but he kind of switched around the genders. And I can't remember exactly how he did it, but he mixed them all up. And what he found was that when the students thought the composition was by a boy, they gave it a higher grade. And when they thought it was by a girl, they gave it a lower grade. And this was students who had done a course on musical meaning and gender and who thought that they didn't harbour assumptions. And I think that's extremely challenging. It challenges me because I think I still harbour assumptions. I think we all harbour assumptions about all sorts of things. And of course, it's not just gender. The same processes operate precisely with race, also with class, with disability, with ideas of intelligence, ethnicity, religion. You can apply the same theory about musical practice and musical meaning to any of those areas. And if it's the case that we human beings, and more importantly for our purposes, we music educators harbour prejudices about these things which we don't even really know about ourselves, then that's really important. So I think you asked me what was the main message of the book. I would say something like that.
Thank you. Let's take a slightly different direction. You and I spoke recently about a possible emergence from retirement for you. What could possibly be alluring enough to drag you out of an idyllic life in a cottage in the Welsh hills? What is something?
Yeah, well, as you know, Gareth, I mean, I've never completely retired. I still sit on the boards of about 12 journals, and I do lots of refereeing for book presses, and I do quite a lot of talks like this. So I've never completely retired. I couldn't completely retire from my beloved subject of music education, but I had decided to stop doing any more research and writing. And yes, sure enough, just before lockdown actually, and then again during lockdown, I found myself making a self-accompanied an accompanied CD of Dowland songs from the Elizabethan period, Elizabeth I, that is. So we're around 1600. I think you can see my beautiful spinet in the background there. I played these songs on the spinet. They were actually written for the lute, but they work really nicely on spinet, I think. And I ended up making a CD. And then I ended up making another CD using the same instrument of Italian arias from the 17th and 18th centuries. And in this process, I began to become absolutely fascinated about the notion of self-accompaniment. Something that, if you think about it, you never see a classical singer doing. In popular music, to some extent in jazz, and of course in folk and traditional musics, it's so common to see somebody singing and playing an instrument at the same time. It could be they're singing solo and playing a solo instrument, or it could be that they're in a band. They might even be playing bass guitar and singing backing vocals or lead vocals. Singing and playing together in popular music is just totally normal. And I just began to sort of be really, really curious about this whole field and started looking around for research in it. And there's hardly any. There's hardly any research. The research I came across was excellent research, but it was historical, looking at the fact that actually people did used to accompany themselves in classical music, vocal performance, right up until less than 100 years ago when it died out. But also I discovered there's no research on self-accompaniment in popular music either, or traditional music, or jazz. What's going on mentally, cerebrally? What's it like as a performer to be accompanying yourself? Because I found, having been a soloist all my life, either piano or choral, I mean vocal, or including singing in choirs, accompanying myself was a different musical experience to being accompanied by somebody else. I felt more immersed in the music. I felt closer to the music. I learned a lot about the music, and I discovered that these other two PhD theses, which look historically at self-accompaniment, both of their authors, Jan Nistabak, I might have got his first name wrong, and Robin Beer, they also tried self-accompaniment, and they also felt they were more immersed in the music. So I would like to start a project now on self-accompaniment. I'm going to look, if I get the funding, at self-accompaniment in classical singing first, because that's the one which has really left it behind, except for a bit of early music, classical singing and contemporary classical music. But 18th, 19th century classical music, you hardly ever see or hear anyone accompanying themselves. But then I also, you know, if I live long enough, I would start wanting to look at self-accompaniment in popular music as well. And for example, do you produce a better performance if, say you took a singer, maybe it could be a pop singer or a jazz singer, and they are singing a song with piano accompaniment, somebody else is accompanying them? Would it be a better performance if they accompanied themselves, or would it be a less good performance? And I'm devising a little experiment to test that out in the classical field. So yeah, I just began to get really excited about this, and it pulled me out of saying I'm never going to do any more research again.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, Martina, or do we need to? Okay, I'll ask you one more thing, and then we're going to take some questions from the chat. So the Journal of Popular Music Education, for which you are on the editorial board, thank you. We published a special issue in April this year that looked at popular music education in Wales.
Yes.
So now that you live in Wales, is there anything, what can you tell APME folks about popular music or music generally in the Wye Valley or? Music
in Wales, well, I mean, some people listening to this from different parts of the world probably have never heard of Wales. It, of course, as you all know, the United Kingdom is made up of 4 countries. There's a lot of disputation, of course, about that, but there's Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So Wales is a country within the United Kingdom. It has its own language. Not everybody who's Welsh speaks it, but more and more and more Welsh people are speaking it. It's compulsory at schools. And it has a very, very rich tradition of music making, as well as storytelling and poetry and art appreciation. Within the UK, Wales is most famous musically for its male voice choirs. And it's really, really true. When I came coming to live here, I found it really, really true. There are male voice choirs all over the place. And in church, for example, in England, I heard a story about an organist who was asked to play in Wales. He was accustomed to playing in England in church services, and he started to play the organ. And in England, he hears about 2 or 3 voices kind of crackling on in the background. When he played in Wales, he sort of went, wah! Because this fantastic sound came from the congregation. So all that's true. And on top of that, in this lovely town, slightly unusual town where I live, with a population of 1,500 people, we have an open mic night once a week when there's no COVID, and it's happening outside now at the moment. We have an open mic night once a week. We have jazz once a week, sort of traditional trad jazz, 30s, 40s jazz. We used to have something called Hey Jazz, which introduces jazz musicians to Hey. We have classical music here. We have early music here. It's just musically such a rich place. It's wonderful. You must come one day to the Hey Literary Festival if you can.
Thank you. That's an invitation to everybody at the conference, by the way.
Yes, it is, but not all to stay at my house.
I was talking a couple of weeks ago. I had Claire Hall, who's at Monash University, come and visit my class via Zoom, and she did some research into choral singing, and she was looking at gender and choral singing and how boys develop sort of sense of masculinity through singing or don't. And I think she did her research in Australia, and I'm brought up the Welsh tradition as a very kind of different context for that. It's kind of a when I lived in Wales as well, it struck me as in the UK, in England, oops, it kind of felt very different. But in Wales, it was kind of it felt, I don't know, it seemed like a very different gendered expression somehow.
It really is. And I'm sitting here, if I look through that window, if the blind wasn't down, I'm seeing England because there's a hill there. I'm so close to the English border that I look at England. But this is a different country. Wales is a different country, and it's a wonderful country. Yeah, love it.
I had one more question for you that I can't find. Oh no, here we go. The last one on my list was, What career advice might you have for, say, a middle-aged British scholar drummer who fairly recently moved to the US from London and still feels every day like they're not sure what they're doing?
Oh, Gareth, I've never come across anybody with more energy and creativity than you, so I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay. So there was Kat Reiner just asked a question about your research looking into self-accompanying singers. Are you also interested in maybe brain scans of what happens when people do that as well? And what are the questions you're thinking of asking? I know you haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to obviously have the possibility to do brain scans. It's not my field as a sociologist, but we are going to get voice scientists on board in the project if we get the funding, and I think it would be amazing to see what happens in a brain scan. It certainly feels very different. It's like if when you're playing the piano or singing without doing the other, if this much of your brain is being used, self-accompanying feels like, oh, this much of your brain is being used. I don't know how that would prove up scientifically. But for example, one of the things we're going to do, if you want to know, you asked me, what are we going to do? I mean, obviously we're going to interview, we're going to questionnaire lots of singers, but we're going to get some singers who have never done self-accompanying before to volunteer to learn a song which they will accompany themselves. We're going to video it and audio record it, and we're also going to ask them to sing the same song with an accompanist. And then we're going to not show the video so that the panel won't know if the performance is self-accompanied or not. And we're going to mix all the audio examples up and ask a panel of voice experts, singing teachers, singers, music teachers, and so forth, to assess the recordings and to write in qualitative comments about them, so that we can see from that, hopefully, whether the idea, which is, I didn't tell you this, but I did a little pilot study before I applied for this, and people in the classical field feel quite scared of self-accompanying, that they might be accused of being amateurist, that they might not be able to sing as well as they normally would. And so I want to see if actually all those things are corroborated by a panel of judges who don't even know if it was self-accompanied or not. That's the little experiment amongst lots of other things that we want to do in the...
Interesting. Thank you. The problem with this chat was I was scrolling the wrong way. So now I've figured it out. Up is down, down is up, or maybe down is down now. Anyway, someone was asking about diversity in the Welsh music scene. The question is, how diverse is the Welsh music scene and voice choirs? Because you mentioned male voice choirs. Is there anything? What else is happening in Welsh music?
Yeah, I mean, in Welsh music specifically, there's a revival of Welsh traditional music. A lot of people, including myself, actually, I started learning Welsh so that I could sing some Welsh traditional songs at the open mic, accompanying myself on my spinet. And there's more and more sort of feeling that the Welsh traditional music wants to get an airing, and it's nothing like Scottish or Irish or English traditional music is. It's rather different. It's more like a sort of hymn-like based tunes with incredibly beautiful words. So there's that, and of course there's orchestras and choirs, and there's a Welsh rock scene as well, some of whom are Welsh people who make rock music and sing in English, but others who sing in Welsh. There's Welsh hip hop with some rappers singing in Welsh, and some Welsh rappers with a Welsh identity but singing in English. So I would say it's an extremely diverse scene here. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's a question here. Now it's just jumped up. One moment. Yes. Greetings from Sydney. You mentioned that a lot of good work has been done since your seminal research on popular music and informal learning. What interests you most about the direction the field has taken? And you're not obligated to say my work, by the way, with you. It's fine.
Apart from Gareth's work. I feel very excited about the massive interest I can feel in equality issues. You know, when I wrote How Popular Musicians Learn, and also the study that came after it, Music Informal Learning and the School, taking pop musicians learning approaches into school classrooms as far as feasible, I didn't have time. It wasn't that I didn't want to, but I just didn't have space or time to look at issues of equality. And so to me, one of the most exciting things since then, and also about this conference, is of course the interconnections that are being made between popular music and issues of social justice, equality, access and opportunity. I'm very excited about that. And of course, another thing that wasn't really there when I wrote How Popular Musicians Learn, YouTube was only just beginning in a few pockets. And so obviously the internet and other music technologies, which have grown up exponentially since that time, I think there's lots of exciting work going on in those fields as well. So I'm probably missing out other things, but those are the first two areas that leap to my mind.
Thank you. I think we've got maybe time for one more question, one or two. So someone here is saying, from Brian Powell says, are there any particular experiences that stick out to you as especially memorable from your career, either as a performer, teacher, researcher?
You know, when you say that at the end of a long discussion, I was saying to somebody just the other day when I was singing in the Bach St. Matthew Passion, the end of that, I don't know if you know that work, but it's one of the most beautiful, beautiful things ever. That would be one of my experiences that sticks out. Other experiences professionally are when I first started talking to people about how popular musicians learn. The reception at that time, it was a long time ago, and the reception that I was getting from people was way beyond my wildest expectations. That people were so, I thought people would say this is rubbish, this is a waste of time. I thought pop musicians would say we all know how we learn anyway, and teachers would say we're not going to do that, but it's not what happened. And so that was, I can remember one of the very first conferences where I gave these ideas out, and that was a great moment when I thought, yes, finding an echo here with other people. There are so many. So I've given you a musical example and a professional music educational example, I hope there's, but also, yeah, I mean, in the classroom, you know, when one of the most exciting things that I found was seeing kids who had been written off by their teachers as not only disaffected, uninterested in music education, lacking in musical talent and ability, and previously been excluded from their classrooms. When I saw kids like that, which I did again and again and again, engaging, leading their groups, being totally involved, learning musical skills, I suppose that, if anything, that's the most exciting part of my career. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we'll leave it there, Lucy. Thank you so much. I should tell you, by the way, I just counted 36 people in the room here, and we've got 59 online. So
that's lovely.
So people turned up to listen to you this morning. So thank you so very much, Lucy Green, for being with us this morning. Should we give Lucy a round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to me. And as I said, you are all invited to Hay, and if you come, you must seek me out. Good luck, everybody, for your careers, and have an absolutely wonderful conference.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye for now.